Dr. Dan Biddle from Genesis Apologetics, certainly no stranger to standing for truth. Not your first time here, Dr. Dan. So it's great to have you back. Dan, I'm excited for your presentation or talk titled Top Evidences for Noah's Worldwide Flood. We are going to have Sam give you a formal introduction. As you get that ready, Sam, I'll remind the audience, as we are doing this live, we're well over 200 people in the live chat enjoying this. We will be having a roughly 20-minute panel discussion or audience Q&A once we're done with our 4 presentations. So please, if you do have a question or even an objection, just make sure to send those in a professional and respectful manner, and we will have some fun engaging and interacting with your comments. Sam, if you'd like to give our guest here, our third speaker for the night, a formal introduction.
Absolutely. Dr. Dan Biddle is the president of Genesis Apologetics Incorporation, a 501c3 organization dedicated to training youth pastors, parents, and students about Genesis, creation, and the flood. Daniel has authored and edited 12-plus books and several articles on these topics, produced 3 films on Genesis and apologetics, and is working on a 4th, The Tower of Babel, coming to theaters in 2026, produced over 100 training videos on the Genesis Apologetics YouTube channel with 223,000 subscribers, more than 23 million views, and content translated into 13 languages. Daniel has given hundreds of presentations to thousands of people on these topics. Daniel's professional background includes an undergraduate and graduate work in theology, apologetics, training as a behavioral scientist, a PhD in industrial organizational psychology, and 20 years experience in expert witness consulting and testimony in state and federal cases involving scientific research methods, statistics, and psychometrics. Daniel and his wife, Jenny, live in Folsom, California, and enjoy their 4 adult children. While Daniel has been a Christian since the age of 11, his position on the specific chronology of Genesis has remained undeclared until 2011, when the evidence surrounding the fossil record, dinosaurs in particular, flood geology, and his biblical exegete led him to the historical position on the Genesis account.
Sam, appreciate that. Dr. Dan, how are you tonight?
I'm doing great, you guys. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. This is too much fun.
Amen. I completely agree. Let's get right into it, brother. I'm excited
Great.
for your talk.
I will pull up your PowerPoint here and let me know when you can see that full screen.
We are good to go. The floor is yours, Dan.
Okay, terrific. Well, you guys, thank you again for having me and Dr. Thomas and Guliuzza. Those were fantastic presentations. We love what you guys do at ICR, and we're glad to share the stage with you guys. So just to start out, this is going to be a very quick tour, about 20 minutes worth of evidences. If you want the deep take on Noah's flood, we have a 2-hour film that was in about 1,000 theaters last year. It's now free on YouTube. You can just go to noahsflood.com or pull it up on YouTube by just searching for The Ark in the Darkness. It's currently free. And here's why this is important. This is a plaque that you can find at the Creation Museum at Answers in Genesis. They have a great ministry and a great full-size ark in the middle of America that you can go see. It's incredible. So if Satan were to say anything about the flood, he would say this: if I can convince you that the flood was not real, then I can convince you that heaven and hell are not real. And today it's not some, it's not half, but most of Christians graduating, at least in California, from high school are being converted into theistic evolutionists, believing that God used a long, slow, clumsy, murderous process to bring about life on earth. So the stakes are high and the significance of the flood is very real. So let's take a look at the first evidence, and that's that flood evidences or flood legends are everywhere. Here's one table. There are many different ones that we can share, but when you take a look at all of the different cultures around the world, there's over 300 of them that have flood myths and legends, and many of them you can put out on a grid work like this that have similarity, like there was a destruction by water, the humans were saved, the animals were saved. There was one guy that God or the gods appointed to do it. This is just one chart. There are many like this, but there's at least 300 worldwide flood stories from around the world, and they have remarkable and striking similarities that overlap the actual Genesis account. I mean, it's remarkable. You can even look at the Chinese ancient writing, and to say the word or write the word boat, you would say large ship with 8 people. And of course, that's very reminiscent of the Genesis account where you have 8 people on a large ship. Um, that's one book by Bill Cooper that's come up with all kinds of evidences from a worldwide perspective about all the different flood legends. Another one of my favorite, is by Nick here. This is a book called Echoes of Ararat, where he's compiling all kinds of different flood legends and myths and stories around North America and South America that have echoes from both the flood account and the Babel dispersion. And you guys, it's a great read. It's really incredible how much evidence there is from a historical basis about a worldwide flood. Every single dot that you see on this animation here is a culture where a flood myth, an ancient flood myth or legend, has been documented. And look what happens when you spin the globe and get to North America. You guys, the Native American people carried with them a very clear account of the flood after the Babel dispersion, just thousands of years after. They're in North America, and you go interview these tribes, and they have remarkable histories about the flood, and some of them have an uncanny parallel to the Genesis account. When we look further or more closely at the ancient Near East, we have all kinds of Babylonian flood accounts. We have the Eridu tablet, the Gilgamesh epic, the Simon's Ark tablet, the Atrahasis epic. The Middle East, which is of course where the Ark landed and where the Babel dispersion happened, has all kinds of incredible, very ancient accounts about the flood. Here's what they look like. A number of them are etched out on cuneiform or clay tablets, but they have incredible overlaps to the flood. And one of the things you'll notice when you look at these epics and these ancient Near Eastern mythological accounts is that the further you go back in time, the more mythical accounts will get. It doesn't work the other way. At the very, very root of some of these, you're going to have the truthful account, which is a Genesis account. But these stories don't tend to get more truthful over time. They tend to get more mythical. So when you reverse engineer and go back to these ancient flood myths, they have an incredible origin or root in the Genesis account. And they all seem to draw on these traditional elements, things like there's a God who's going to bring punishment to the world. There's one chosen guy to save everybody with his family and the animals. There a God or gods are going to give a dimensions to a ship that's going to save everything. They're going to survive the flood. Many of these accounts actually have that he's going to send a bird out and to find dry land and have sacrifice to God afterwards. So isn't it interesting that these ancient Near Eastern myths and a lot of the stories carried over by the Native Americans all still have these same common themes and elements? When you look at ancient writing that include, of course, a lot of these myths, it's interesting that if you interview experts on cuneiform writing, like the curator of cuneiform from the British Library, they'll say things like, when you really press them and say, well, how old are these writings really? How old are they where you can confirm for sure how old they are? They'll give you a bracket saying about 750 BC to about 1500 BC, because the people recording these events can correlate them to observe things that we know happened on Earth during those times. When you start going back further, you have to start borrowing faith. And of course, isn't it interesting that humans have been smart for a long time, but all human writing vanishes about the time the Bible puts the flood? That's certainly no coincidence. You can look at Hebrew writing, Chinese, Egyptian, ancient Greece. It all vanishes, so we have to use faith. We have to evoke faith for what we're going to fill up in the time before the flood. But I find it fascinating that all human writing and history vanishes about the same time the Bible puts Noah's flood. Let's look at the next evidence here is the feasibility of the ark. When you compare the ark and the dimensions that God gave to Noah for building it to the Epic of Gilgamesh, we immediately see all kinds of differences. The biblical ark had 50 to 75 years to build it. It's over 500 feet long. The duration of the flood was a year, and it's definitely seaworthy. You can contrast that with the Epic of Gilgamesh arc, where the flood was only a week. It only took a week to build the cube shape arc that had 6 or 7 stories to it. It's 200 feet on each side. The first rotation at sea is going to kill everything, so it's definitely a mythical account. Then you have the Simmons Arc tablet, same thing. You've got a circular arc, which is also not very seaworthy. But when you look at the arc itself and you run hydrodynamic testing to it, it definitely was seaworthy. We've hired maritime experts and engineers to model the arc and show that you can crank up what's called a Beaufort storm scale to level 7, 8, 9, 10. You cannot get this thing to capsize. It would hold up to all types of drama out in the ocean. But when you start rotating the Epic of Gilgamesh, it would definitely fall right apart. It's even been modeled here in the early 90s at the Korean Research Naval Center. They tried 12 different models and it was ideal. The dimensions of the arc were ideal with respect to stability, comfort, and strength. So here we have the Epic of Gilgamesh arc, and when you crank up the storm scale to 8, 9, or 10, it's going to start rotating. Same with the circular arc, but the Noah's Ark, that using the dimensions that God gave, is going to hold up. In fact, it can even go back and forth to up to 45 degrees and it would still right itself. So we have an ancient biblical account with an arc dimension that could actually work. Number 3, let's look at unimaginable numbers of dead dinosaurs mixed with marine life. Here's the most obvious thing about the flood. If you look in the middle of America and you plot out the Jurassic and Cretaceous fossils from Fossil Works here, you have an amazing, huge dinosaur kill zone. It spans 1,800 miles up and down, about 1,000 miles wide, 1 million square miles of a dinosaur kill zone. And these creatures are buried in a matrix, mostly of 3 products: mud, sand, and ash. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But here is some really huge, obvious evidence for you. How in the world do you bury dinosaurs and mix them with marine life over a quarter of the landscape in America? So let's take a look at one of these areas called the Morrison Formation. It's a swath of 600,000 miles encompassing about 13 states in the middle of America. If you take a cross-sectional look at where we just zoomed into, which is Morrison, Colorado, you'll find that that 600,000 mile surface area called the Morrison Formation is actually a 300-foot thick mud pancake that incorporates over 50 dinosaur species that all bought it at the same time. Most large forms of dinosaurs in the Jurassic are all found buried there. How did they all die at the same time and get jumbled up and mixed up with marine life? Isn't that quite fitting to the flood? All kinds of fossil occurrences, different genre, many different species, and that's just what we found. And they believe we only know about the top 20% or so of the Morrison Formation. So 600,000 square miles are filled with these creatures, and it took a flood to do it. Number 4, Dr. Thomas covered this. I'm going to share just a few of my perspectives because this was one of the most convincing things that shifted me to becoming young Earth creationists. And as Brian mentioned, we're now up to 127 peer-reviewed secular science journals that it's established not 1, not 2, not half a dozen, but 16 different types of bioorganic materials that are found in dinosaur bones that should not be there. Mark Armitage took a Triceratops horn, demineralized it, and it still has soft, stretchable, pliable material in it. You should not be able to do this with a Triceratops bone that's millions upon millions of years old, but yet you can. Very, very interesting. So over 120 peer-reviewed journal articles, over at least 16 different types of bioorganics. But the last 2 that they found are, get this, cartilage and nerve cells. How on earth can you fossilize and preserve dinosaur cartilage and actual nerve cells for millions of years? You can't. You guys, the evidence is on our side. It's case closed. These materials are young and they are fresh. The biggest one that I find most convincing, as Dr. Thomas went over tonight, is collagen, because I've read the literature. Dr. Thomas is a scholar in the literature, and I found at least 5 different scientific studies that have tried to estimate the maximum lifespan of collagen. And lo and behold, as Dr. Thomas said, The most they'll give it is about 900,000 years. So you draw the cap at about 1,000,000 years. So how on earth is dinosaur collagen lasting in dinosaurs if they're really 65 million years old? When you run the math, it's about 100 times longer than current science journals say it can last, but it's still there. So it's really easy to shift this evidence over to our perspective and say that these bones are just thousands of years old, not millions of years old. Next, let's take a look at the rapid catastrophic burial of these dinosaurs and how they're mixed with marine life. Here's an interesting article from a secular paleontologist, Dr. John Horner. Look at the subtitle of his book here. It's called Digging Dinosaurs, but the subtitle is quite interesting. He says, The Search That Unraveled the Mystery of Baby Dinosaurs. And here's a quote from his book. He said they had discovered one huge bed of Maiasaur dinosaurs stretching 1¼ miles going east to west, which would, of course, fit the flood because we believe that the sheet layers that are deposited in America are from tsunamis that are coming up from the sides of the coast. And he says, look, there were up to 30 million fossil fragments in that 1 mile just over an area. They had discovered the tomb of 10,000 dinosaurs, 10,000 Maiasaura. But here's the catch. There's 10,000 of them, representing 30 million fossils spread out over a mile directionally, and they couldn't find a single young. Every single one of the 10,000 dinosaurs that they found were between 9 and 23 feet. So what on earth could cause a panic of a herd of dinosaurs, 10,000 of them, to scamper and run and ditch the babies, the youth, the adolescent, the juveniles? They're not around. These things booked it, and they were all found buried catastrophically in a flood. I find that very interesting about how quickly this really happened. Dr. Warner has also done a book I'm gonna show here in a minute, but here's another one about bone beds. Dr. Werner's book has established that of 100,000 dinosaur fossils that have been found, only about 3% of them are articulated or found complete. 97% of them are found scrambled and disarticulated because something catastrophic hit them. In fact, you can find in the Lance Formation locations where there's huge dinosaur burials that are in sorted beds, and the experts there would say these dinosaurs were hit and killed by a tsunami miles away and then moved and reinterred over here where they were buried. So something happened quick and quite catastrophically. Dr. Warner's book has got a great way to look at that. And frequently when you go to these museums, you'll see these dinosaurs, theropods particularly, in the dinosaur death pose with their necks arched back as they're suffocating, gasping for air. And that's because they were killed by the mud that they're entombed in. They didn't just die and lay down and get covered over by thousands of years worth of mud or atmospheric dirt. No, they're actually buried in the product that was responsible for their death. More on that as we go. And it comes down to these three products: mud, sand, and ash. How in the world do we find these dinosaurs buried in those three products? But that's what we find. When we dig in many different places around the United States, we find that these dinosaurs are buried in a matrix of those three things. It's very indicative. It's a telltale sign of how they died, and it happens to fall right on top of a biblical explanation. So the interesting insight about all these different accounts that want to talk about the flood and ancient histories and everything, I'm going to say that the Bible is the only ancient text that describes the processes of the flood. It's got timelines, mechanics, it's got how high the water came, when it came, it's got the 40-day events, 150-day events. It's got a whole narrative there of the flood process, and it actually gets it right, which is incredible. You can't say that about any other ancient text. It's incredible. So here's where the key verse comes in Genesis 7:11. It's the 600th year of Noah's life, and the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. So something happened. It started on the ocean floor, and it began, and then later the upwards, the water came all the way upwards, was about 22 feet over the highest hill and at zenith at day 150. So we have the flood mechanics, and the processes all laid out in Scripture. And I also find this verse very interesting. One could say, when you look at this verse carefully, it's talking about water going forth and returning, like sheets coming up, sheets coming back off. And it could be an indication of what we know happened during the flood, tsunamis, multiple tsunamis happening in cycles. Dr. John Baumgartner came out with this model called catastrophic plate tectonic, he and 5 other PhD scientists. He developed a software system that was based on it, showing how Pangea or a Pangea-like formation was rapidly split apart as the fountains of the Great Deep broke open. This has been studied. Layers of research have been done on this. The model checks out, and that's exactly what would produce these 3 products that we find the dinosaurs entombed in. When the fountains of the Great Deep broke open, it's going to produce mud and sand from the subduction, and the subduction are going to create a whole bunch of slip faults that are going to happen as the newly produced seafloor dives underneath the land continents, breaks loose, and it's going to cause a tsunami to come up on land. And it's that same rapid subduction of the new seafloor that's going to cause volcanism, that's going to be burying the dinosaurs as these tsunami cycles are happening in waves and repeated cycles. So here's what it might have looked like when the fountains of the Great Deep broke open. We have underwater rifting here. We have the lava coming up. It's going to create these huge, super critically heated steam jets that are going to come up, bring up waves of tsunamis. And we can see this on Earth today. It's a 40,000 mile rift system, produces the new seafloor. It comes and hits the land mass. It's going to bind, develop tension, and then launch water onto the Earth in cycles over and over again. Here's another image of that new seafloor being created. It's going to come, it's going to be like a conveyor belt. It's going to spread the new seafloor on both sides. It's going to hit the land and then build up tension and create a tsunami. So here's that new seafloor, hits the landmass. It's going to bind, just like what happened in Japan, where there was a 60-foot seafloor slip that resulted in tsunamis. When that tsunami happens, it's going to come up and wash these dinosaurs and bury them in layers. And that's exactly how we see them buried today, in layers full of mud, which is exactly what a tsunami would do. So where did the ash come from? Well, same thing. We have the subduction happening. We have volcanism along the continental margins, and it's raining down on these dinosaurs. And we can look in several spots where what's called the Independence Dyke Swarm, which is a 375-mile linear rift system that produced 4,000 cubic miles of ash and blanketed half of America. Huge amounts of ash came and buried over, and enough to bury parts of entire states, you guys. It's just incredible to look at this, and it's deeper than you can imagine, over 100 meters deep in some region. But that volcanic system is responsible for burying the dinosaurs with mud and sand concurrently, and that's why we find them buried in those 3 products. So just the Brushy Basin member produced ashes 110 meters thick in eastern Utah and 35 other locations, and it's filled with dinosaurs. So by comparison, you can see how much ash was produced during the flood. When the Independence Dyke Swarm broke open, the smallest square over all the way to the right is how much ash was released when Mount St. Helens blew its top. By comparison, it's just almost unimaginable how much ash came out of that system during the flood. Here we see layer after layer of the ash layer that you can see here with mud and sand. Just it's like pancaked right on top of each other, and we find dinosaurs buried in all of these layers. And so these dinosaurs were killed and buried by the processes and products that bury them. They didn't just, go out to eat, have too much to eat someday, get a disease or whatever, and lay down and get covered by atmospheric dust. So they were killed by the products that they're buried in. The next one is we'll look at how these massive oceanic plates were dragged under the continents. We know this happened. Here's an underground radar that was done of the Farallon plate. We can still see it subducted. This was responsible for a lot of the volcanism and a lot of the tsunamis that came up on the North Americas. Here's the conjugate Shatsky Rise, which is an oceanic plateau that was pulled from the southwest there and drug underneath America, causing a lot of subduction related activity and a lot of mountain building. Some of it happened during the flood, but a lot of it happened afterwards. So the seafloor that's being pulled underneath is what's going to be causing a lot of these tsunamis. Brian touched a little bit about on this, but when you look at the fossil record, isn't it interesting that the first three Sloss megasequences, the Sauk, Tippecanoe, and Kaskaskia, are mostly marine life? It's not until you get much higher that we start seeing land. This is exactly, or land creatures, this is exactly what we would expect and predict with the flood. You would have the marine life in the shallow seas buried first, then the land creatures are going to be the next ones to have it. And that's exactly what we see these Sloss mega sequences happening. We don't get land creatures until we get to the Absaroka and the Zuni, just as Brian talked about in his presentation. Here's a fossil distribution, a frequency chart showing all the marine life in those first three mega sequences. Then when you go up, that's when all of a sudden we start getting all these land creatures deposited. It's perfectly fitting of Noah's flood. And that's because, again, we're going to have all this new seafloor going. It's going to bury these sequences first, and then it's going to come up on land, and that's when it's going to be responsible for burying the creatures. It wasn't until the Zuni formation that we start seeing at the very, very top all these land creatures getting buried. It was the zenith of the flood at day 150. That was the dinosaurs' last stand. Just a few more things here, and then we'll close out. Evidence 9 is correlated fossils and oil. Isn't it interesting when you take these continents, and we know that they're perfectly matching when you fit them back together? Because remember, the Bible says that on the same day, all the fountains of the great deep broke open, and that was the active force that pushed these continents apart. Each one of these little dots is a fossil bone bed, and when you put the continents back together, we can see entire ecosystems where you can see a brother buried on one side of the continent and its sister on the other side, cousins buried on either side of these things, now separated by thousands of miles. But when you match the continents back together, the same flora and fauna is buried in the different mud systems that push them apart, but they perfectly correlate when you put them together. You can run the fossil counts and all the data is there. And isn't it also interesting that the oil on each sides of these continents is actually correlated? The chemistry of the oil indicates that the same type of ecosystem, the same biosphere, was being buried during the flood when these continents were pushed apart. Very fascinating evidence here. And the last one that we'll look at is the receding stage of the flood. And that's when God said he shut off the fountain. What that's going to do, the cooling effect is going to pull the water back off of the continents, first in sheet flow and then in channelized cuts. And that's exactly what we see in places like now the Gulf of America, where we have what's called the Whopper sand. Dr. Tim Clary with ICR has done tons of study on this. We have all kinds of runoff from the Tejas major Sloss mega sequence. And we have the Monterey Bay underwater sea canyon here that's about the same size as the Grand Canyon, but it's all underwater, and it happened from catastrophic water that was sheeting and then flowing in channelized cuts off of the continents. So I think we have evidences on a number of different perspectives, and I think we just gave a raced tour through them tonight, but I personally find them quite convincing. So we'll close out there and do the Q&A at the end, I guess, huh?
Dan, we definitely titled this seminar correctly, Young Earth Creation, Incredible Evidence. That was a great presentation.
Thanks.
3 information-packed presentations so far.